Well, good morning. I'm going to say just a word before we get started to let you know what we're going to be doing this morning. We obviously are continuing our study of the book of John that we've been doing on Zoom, and I don't know about you, but I'm very excited to be back in a setting where we can sit in the same room and study God's Word together, not as intimate as we're accustomed to in classrooms. Hopefully we'll get back to that before too long. We liked the idea when we were on Zoom of having a panel discussion, so we're going to try and see how it works for a few weeks, and then we'll kind of assess where we're at. But we're going to try the same format. So Stephen will be leading our study every week, but we'll have a rotating group of people who help him with the class, and they'll be making comments. But the other thing that we're going to do, if you've got a question you want to ask or a comment that you want to make, we ask that you hold your hand up, and we've got two remote mics that will be going around the room too. So hold your hand up, and they'll get to you as quickly as possible, and then you can ask your question or make your comment. We are streaming this, hopefully. That's working this morning, so that will help the people who are watching at home to hear what you had to say or the question that you ask, but it also helps us here in this room. That's one of the problems with being in this bigger rooms. You can't ever hear what someone from the audience is saying, so hopefully that will solve that problem. So just hold your hand up, and guys who've got the remote mics will get to you as quickly as possible. We've got a good turnout this morning. I know the kids are excited. I had one of them tell me this morning she was fired up to be back in classes, so we're excited about that and excited to be able to study together. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll start our study. Lord, we're so thankful this morning that we can be together to study your word. We are thankful that throughout this period of time we've had means to study together remotely, but we're excited to be back in each other's presence and in your presence to study your word. We pray that our study will be profitable, that you will guide the thoughts of those who are reading this and help us to gain a better understanding of what you have us to do. Lord, we're thankful for your love, your mercy, and your grace. We love you. Continue to bless us in Jesus' name.
All right, so we'll pick up where we left off, which is John chapter 7 and verse 25, and we'll try to get to the end of the chapter today, but if we don't, that's okay. There's a lot to talk about. So in what we see in John chapter 7, at the beginning, Jesus' brothers were kind of taunting him and telling him to go up to the feast publicly, knowing, perhaps, that people were seeking to kill him. And there's a discussion where he will say, I'm not going, it's not my time, it's always your time. And then he will go up quietly, and he'll begin teaching in the temple, and there's some dialogue back and forth between Jesus and the people there, and a discussion about doing the Lord's will. And that kind of gets us then to verse 25, where there is some questioning about who Jesus is, again. So there's this constant discussion or murmuring throughout the people of Israel where there is a messianic expectation. And they're constantly asking, could this be the one? Could this be the one that was talked about in the prophets? Could this be the prophet? Who is Jesus? Is he good for the people, bad for the people? A lot of discussion. And that's kind of where we pick up in verse 25. And so what I thought we could do is we'll just read through a section and then continue what we've been doing on the panel, talking about what we notice, what's interesting, and anything that we have learned. So let's start in verse 25, and we'll read down through verse 31. So some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, is this not the man whom they seek to kill? And here he is, speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ? But we know where this man comes from, and when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from. So Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple, you know me, and you know where I am from. But I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me. So they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him, because his hour had not yet come. Yet many of the people believed in him, and they said, when the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done? So what are some things in that section that you guys noticed, or some things that you thought were interesting?
Well, I wanted to back up just for a second back to verse 24, because I think it has meaning in to what they're about to say to him. He says, don't judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. We've kind of misused that passage a little bit, or at least taken it out of its context as kind of the counterbalance to the idea of judge not, that you be not judged. And that's probably not a good idea here, because that's not at all the context. And the context, in fact, I think points us straight into this passage, because he's really talking about, don't judge me based on what you see, judge based on what you watch me do. And so then he gets here, and immediately the crowd says, isn't this the guy they're wanting to kill? And then they ask next, could this really be the Christ? Therefore, because they're not stopping him. And then immediately they come back with the response, yeah, but we know where this guy's from, and we're not supposed to know where the Christ is from, which is interesting, because I think this is from Jeremiah 30 and verse 21, but I'm not positive that there's just this one-to-one correlation between what the Old Testament says about the Christ and between the idea that they have at this point that they're not supposed to know where he comes from. I think Jeremiah is talking more about the fact that he wouldn't look like a king than the fact that he was going to be from some anonymous source. But that's what I'd love to hear somebody out there, and I think Steve's got somebody.
I had to come from nowhere, but they reasoned that since they knew where he came from, that he couldn't be the Messiah. And simply it seems like they just didn't understand or qualify it by the scriptures.
Yeah, I agree. And like I say, the question to me is exactly why were they getting it at this point from, if it's from Jeremiah 30, and I don't know where else it would be from, which doesn't mean that it's not from somewhere else. It just means I couldn't find anything. Then, why were they getting specifically that they wouldn't know where he came from? And my thinking is that just like a lot of other things, and we do it too, they had an idea maybe at this point that, for whatever reason, they wouldn't know where he came from, and the idea from that has sort of morphed through the years into something that was a hard and fast rule that they had that wasn't necessarily based in the text, but had become, like we have sometimes, this idea that, what somebody before me, what Grandpa thought about a text must be what the text actually is. That's my guess.
I think the other piece of this, and it's in the same vein of thought, but what we're seeing are discussions between Jesus and the people. And Jesus is not bending what he's saying. He's very plain and very straight. I am the Son of God. And they're not accepting it. They're not hearing it. And he's already established, if you don't hear it, you have no hope. And I think here, again, he's laying out that same position, because on the Sabbath I made a man's body whole. Well, if you're claiming to be God, you have every right to do whatever you want to do whenever you want to do it. And the judgment there would be the judgment based on Christ's statement. And I think he's trying to get them to hear, and he's going to say it again another way, but it's the same point over and over and over again in this section. I am the Son of God. My message is this. If you hear it, wonderful, come. If you don't hear it, you're condemned.
And I think we have, with the Jeremiah 30, maybe an example of something that I know that I do. We tend to make certain verses or passages the predominant idea when you're talking about a topic, where you have, the other prophets will tell you that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem of Ephrathah. So it's not like the prophets don't speak to the origin of the Messiah, but it seems like what they have done is they've decided that whatever passage they're using to get this idea, they have made that the primary passage. And so in their minds, it seems to override any other reference.
Yeah, and in fact, later in the chapter, the scribes and Pharisees are going to have a more specific idea, and they're going to try to disqualify Jesus on the basis of the idea that they have, which apparently is not the idea that most of the people had. It's kind of interesting. Either way, I think the idea is the same. They were trying to disqualify Jesus based on an external circumstance that, in fact, Jesus has just said to the, especially the leaders, don't judge based on appearances, but judge with righteous judgment. And then here you go. John's good with the irony thing.
So why do y'all think when we get to the authorities and the assumption is here he is speaking openly, but they're not doing anything? Could it be that they know he is the Christ? It's almost like they're assuming that because nobody is arresting him, that maybe they secretly have figured this out and they're holding it back. Maybe we do that sometimes. We jump to conclusions. Why do you think that part of the discussion is present in the text? In verse 26.
Well, I'll tell you what I think, but I'd love to hear somebody in the group say something. I think it's there because John, later in this same paragraph, John is going to explain why it is that this didn't happen, or that the authorities didn't get him, and it's not because they had decided he was the Christ and they couldn't mess with him. In fact, John's going to say it's exactly the opposite, almost, that this happens because, and this, by the way, I think is the third time in this chapter it's been said. Before it was Jesus saying it. He's going to say it didn't happen because his hour had not yet come. That's my guess.
Yeah, I know that I tend to, without getting into too much of the technical information, but there are certain logical fallacies that we all commit when we're thinking through. We're just not thinking through logically or rationally. And we assume that there are reasons why people do things. And sometimes people do things for no reason. Or sometimes they do it for a reason that we don't see or we don't know. And so I have to be careful to make note of that when I read through the text and I see a person in the Bible doing something. If the reason isn't stated specifically for what they're doing, I have to be aware that I will often assume, oh, they've done this because of this reason, and the text doesn't say. And sometimes people will get crossways with each other because of that inference into the text, where you think David did this because of this reason, and somebody else says, well, no, David did it because of this reason. And if you go and you look at the text, it doesn't say. And so I do think when we get to the text, we kind of get that illumination from John. Nobody is arresting Jesus because it's not time. When it is time, they will. But the crowd is doing what we do. They're jumping to conclusions. Well, they must not be arresting him because he really is the Christ. And he is, but that's not why, like you said, that's not why he's being arrested, or they're not arresting him. Okay, so let's get to what I think is a pretty profound statement in verse 28. You know where I come from, but there's somebody who sent me, and you don't know him. What is Jesus saying?
I think as we read that, the introduction to his statement, he said, then Jesus cried out as he taught in the temple. It's as though he knows exactly what they're saying. The time, Christ doesn't do anything that there's not a reason for. And it's this, in this crying out, I understand it's crying out. He's shouting this out to them. It's an emphatic statement that he makes. So I think we shouldn't overlook that it's the timing of this statement, his rebuttal to this murmuring and all that's going on.
And I think it comes back to what you said earlier. This declaration of Jesus that I am the Messiah, and if you don't get it, then...
Well, think about the impact of the statement. He's speaking to Jews, and these are Jews during the Feast of Booths, one of the greatest feasts that they participated in, remembering the time in the wilderness and God's provision for them and care for them. And he says, you don't know that God. And I'm from him. I am him for all intent and purpose. We are one. and you don't know him. This has got to be drawing a line, a gulf. And the gulf is, are you going to listen? Are you going to hear? And they're not hearing. And the people themselves, as you all are talking, I was thinking about this. We, like you said, we do the same thing in verse 27. We don't know where he comes from. We don't know this. You've seen him and you've heard him. You know enough. And I think John's pointing that out. This is the trap we all fall into if we're not careful. Not listening. And it's not our judgment as whether or not he's God. It's his. He is. We're called to accept or not. And that's what he's pointing out here yet again to these people in hard but very clear terms. I've got a feedback on this thing.
There you go.
It's almost like he takes their own argument and uses it against them.
Yep.
You don't know where I'm from because I'm from God. And the reason why you don't know where I'm from is because you don't know God. And that really would be,
Yes.
to a Hebrew ear, that would be the height of criticism.
And remember what he said previously. God knows everyone's going to come. He calls them. How does he call? Through the word. If you hear and accept, you're good. And it goes all the way. That goes all the way back to chapter 1. To those who believe, he gives the right to become sons of God. It's that same picture going over and over and over again that we're seeing.
Yep. So what do you think? And if anybody has a comment or question about stuff we've covered, please don't hesitate to ask just because we move on. But in verse 30, and you guys too, in verse 30, what do you think this looks like? So they are seeking to arrest him, but no one lays a hand on him. So is it like armed guards come to the temple and there's Jesus and they just kind of like chill out around the corners and listen? We do have instances in the Gospels where soldiers will go and hear Jesus and then they'll go back and report and they're like, we've never heard anybody talk like this guy. And so I always wonder, if I try to imagine myself in the crowd, what does this look like? So what do you guys think? It's not significant. It's just an interesting thing. If I'm there, what am I seeing?
Yeah. Well, and that's going to happen later in this chapter, that very inquiry is going to be made by the chief priests, like, why didn't you grab him? And they're just going to say, because we never heard anybody talk like this. It really intrigues me that the text never gives us an inclination to the idea that people saw something in Jesus that was magnetic, that what they heard him say and watched him do was what mesmerized, and that's not the right word, but it brought people to him in such a way that the very idea, and I by the way, I don't think that means these soldiers were believers full on. I think it means that they were scared to death that if they grabbed him that the crowd would go wild. I think that's one of John's key ideas, frankly, is that, and this of course goes back to the Old Testament prophecy about Jesus, right? But the idea that it is that the things Jesus says and does, and they say it, later they'll say nobody ever talked like this man talks. And we'd seen it before because they said, that no one had ever spoken with authority the way that Jesus had. It's just it just seems to me that what we see is constant, that Jesus speaks and people know there is something dramatically different about him.
And I think tied to that, when you go back to the previous chapter, why were they trying to seek to kill him? Because he's claiming to be equal with God. I mean, this is, again, you talk about a stunning statement. He makes the statement and no one can quibble with it. They want to kill him because of it, but they have no basis to go after him. And here he's in their power structure, in their home, so to speak, in their house, and they still can't go after him. They have no basis.
Yeah, and ultimately, they're going to arrest him and convict him based upon what they're accusing him of doing. And so basically, it would be like somebody accused you of doing some crime, and, well, we're just guilty because of this accusation.
Well, remember, they had to ask him, are you the Son of God? And he affirms it.
Yeah.
I mean, he had to give them what they were looking for.
Right. Okay, so his teaching is effective. Many of the people believe in him. And they ask this question, when the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done? And so he does reach some people. People are hearing him teach. They're seeing the things that he's done. People are probably hearing about the feeding that he has done in chapter 6. News travels. It travels by different means in the ancient world, but word gets around.
Yep.
And so when people begin hearing of this man who can heal the sick, who can draw food out of the air, who can do all these things that Jesus is doing, if they're familiar with the Old Testament text and what is predicted, this is a question that somebody would ask if they are coming to believe in Jesus. Could anybody else fulfill the prophecies like this man is doing? And so his preaching is effective, but only to people, it seems, who are willing to listen and who are willing to follow Jesus as he connects the dots. And to those who want to argue with him, they're not rejecting Jesus based on some biblical principle. They're rejecting Jesus on the basis of tradition, on the basis of ideas that they have extrapolated from the biblical text. And so their argument with Jesus would be something not textual explicitly. Does that make sense?
I think tied to that, one of the things that I see in all these discussions is Christ never alters his course. He doesn't, I'll change this tactic to see if I can touch this person. He's just laying the course out there. Are you going to react to it or not? And that kind of goes to your point. If you have text that shows that I'm not the Christ, pull it up. Let's talk about it. They can't.
Okay. We'll move on to the next section, but again, if you have comments or questions or insights about anything that we've done, please feel free at any time. Oh, okay, we've got somebody.
Well, just kind of piggybacking off that, we talk a lot about the gospel is for all, and in one sense it is. It's available to all, but the gospel was designed almost like targeted ads. It's meant to go to a certain type of person. And kind of like my dad has said in the past, when the gospel is accepted or rejected, the gospel's done its job. And, going back to Tim's point, if you're, change your tactic, the gospel should be the only bait that you use. And, if somebody wants it on their terms, that's not who the gospel is seeking out. It's a certain type of soil. It's a certain type of heart.
I think it's a great point, and I think it is one of the great difficulties that a lot of people have with the idea of the gospel being available to everyone, but quite literally understandable only by the ones who want to understand it, who want to get it. And that I think from a worldly perspective, that's hard to deal with. And yet Jesus, just out and out says to the disciples, look, I talk to you in parables so that the people who don't want to know won't get it. And like I say, from a worldly perspective, that's pretty hard. But the what we observe in John constantly is exactly that Jesus says words that there are plenty of people who will take however they want, and they'll do whatever they want based on it. And the gospel wasn't built to force people to obey it. It was built to go to the people whose hearts were right. And remember, Jesus has already said this in this very passage. He said that if somebody wants to know God's will, he'll find it.
Thank you. Well, no, I lost my point. Not good for the new guy.
Well, why?
I'll remember it later.
Yeah, why?
I'll remember it later. I'm sorry.
When you remember, I'll stop. The other thing to remember in this, it sounds awfully hard. And it's a black and white, yes or no kind of situation. But the reality is I suspect some of these very people were there in Acts 2 and turned to the Lord. The very people that yelled, crucify him, now become Christians. This is not to say that you can't turn later and think about it. But it is to say that God's word never changes. The message is the message how we respond to it is the key. And I think that's what we're hearing here, and that's what John is pointing out to us. This is why he's the Son of God. He's the Christ.
My thought did come back to me. The Bible does talk about predestination in one sense, and I think a lot of the religious world has in their mind what that means, and a specific predestination, that God has picked out individual people. It's not that. It's, when the carpet was picked out for this building, the deacon, whoever was involved in it, didn't go and pick out every single square foot of carpet. He picked out a type of carpet and send us this, and that's the kind of predestination that the gospel is targeting.
Yep.
That was my point.
Yes. And again, back in this very passage, anyone who wants to do God's will. So, I mean, the amazing thing is the gospel leads us to love God, but at the same time, it's also acceptable to those who want to love God. And that's something we have to grapple with. I think I do. I have to grapple with that all the time.
And this is a theme all throughout this gospel. You're constantly being presented in the Gospel of John with pictures of the kingdom, and various aspects of that old physical kingdom are being brought forward and saying, here's what the new kingdom is like. And so you've got Jesus in John 4 saying there's a certain type of person God is seeking to worship him. And then it's this person in John 7, the one who seeks to know the Lord's will. And so there very is a targeted ad is a good way to think of it, is God is seeking for a particular type of person. And it's those who will submit to the lordship, the kingship of Jesus. He's the king, not us. It's his kingdom, not ours. And now you will either submit to that lordship or you will rebel against it. And those are really the only two choices. And that's true with Christ. It's true with any government. And we have some...
And to that point, it is so tempting for us when somebody doesn't respond to God's word to think, oh, maybe there's something I can do that will get them to respond. And if we do that, we're creating a disciple to something other than to Jesus. We're not creating a disciple of Jesus's. We're creating a disciple to whatever it was we tried to attract them to. And that's something we really need to be careful about individually as we deal with people and collectively as a church.
Yeah, there's basically two things that you see throughout time and in the text of Scripture. It is the witness of the word itself, the teaching of the word. Here is the text. This is the word. And the impact of the word on human lives. Oh, this is what the word looks like in a human's life when they believe, when they obey, when they follow, when they're transformed. And so sometimes people don't hear the text, but they see the transformation. And that draw of your transformed life will pull them back to the text and say, look, here's what God says. Here is why we live this way. Look at the result. Here is what a disciple looks like. And so we have, that's the witness. And there really is nothing in the text of Scripture aside from those things. So I think that's a good point.
To your point, that's what Christ was doing.
Yes.
Exactly the same thing.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think we also see this in the Old Testament, because throughout the Israelite nation goes back and forth between like having a strong relationship with God and then that fading. And like in Psalm 104 verses 29 and 30, it says, "When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground." So it's that same back and forth where like when they find God, they are renewed. And I feel like that holds true as we're looking at this as well.
All right, so we'll move on. Verse 32. We'll read down through verse 36. The Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these things about him, and the chief priests and Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. Then Jesus said, "I will be with you a little longer, and then I am going to him who sent me. You will seek me, and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come." And so the Jews said to one another, "Where does this man intend to go that we will not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? What does he mean by saying, 'You will seek me and you will not find me, and where I am, you cannot come'?" And so just a couple clarifying things as we read through the text. I think it was actually Tim last week, or maybe the week before, when you see the term Jews in John's gospel, very often it is referring to a specific segment of the Hebrew population, often the religious leaders themselves, the leaders of the nation, the chief priests, the people who will ultimately crucify Jesus. And so it's not referring to all of the people necessarily. And then the dispersion among the Greeks are the Hebrew people who don't live in Judea. So the Hebrew people who would be in Asia Minor, as Paul is traveling around, when you get to the book of Acts, he goes to all these different synagogues. Those would be the people in the dispersion. And so you're still talking about Hebrew people. It still is outside the mind of the religious leaders in Jerusalem that the gospel might actually be for Gentiles too. And so that's kind of the framework there that we've got in this section. So with that, is there anything that you guys noticed or think is interesting? Jim?
I just think it's interesting as we look at all this in the Feast of Tabernacles. And he says in this passage, a little while longer, we're 6 months away from the Passover that leads up to his, arrest and crucifixion. We're down to a very short time, and he's proclaiming all these things. And the more he proclaims this, the more rebuttal we get.
Hold it close to you.
The more rebuttal we get from the Jewish leaders, as you say, it becomes more of an argument about who he is. It just gets stronger and stronger and stronger. But we're about 6 months away in the timeline.
Yeah, absolutely. And it strikes me that this is another theme of not only this passage, but of the whole book of John, is that the response of people who don't get Jesus is almost always to take what he says as something that fits their mindset. So the immediate thing is, says, where I go, you can't come. And they say, is he going out into the dispersion somewhere to where all the Jews are among the Greeks? And then he says, and teach the Greeks. And I don't know whether they're pulling that from Isaiah 49. It would make sense to where Isaiah talks about that he will teach the nations. It makes sense that again, remember that they would be focusing on him. They knew that he was pointing to himself as the Messiah, the prophet, the servant. And so for them to take something like that, I don't think it's out of context for them to or to ask the question, is he going out to teach the Greeks? I don't think at all that that's out of the context of what they would have been hearing from him. It's just interesting that that's the immediate response to where I go, you can't come, is, oh, he's going to, sneak off somewhere and teach some other folks this heresy that he's teaching.
But I think the other side of that is they're asking these questions, but they're not asking Jesus. They're talking among themselves. They don't want to know the answer. Why were the parables? So they might not understand, but what would the apostles, disciples, are they come and ask? What does it mean? They're still doing the same thing. They're hearing him and then trying to come to their own conclusion.
And a lot of times, to kind of bring those together, the framework that you have for your own thinking will limit the conclusions that you can come to by yourself. For example, I've been in classes at the college level where you go through a text, and one of the things that we did was we looked at the fall of Jericho. And from a historical perspective, in professional historiography, God can never be the answer. So when you read through the Old Testament text and the Israelites march around Jericho and they yell and the walls fall over, there's basically two answers that you get from a godless historical perspective. One, either it's made up, that's your first answer, it's just a story they told their kids because it sounds neat. Or two, there was some kind of harmonic frequency that resonated when the people shouted underneath the city and it just happened to make the walls fall over. Well, if you remove God as an answer, then you will never come to the conclusion that the walls fell over because God made them, because he's just not a possibility. And so that's kind of, I think, what we see here with the leaders. Jesus can never be the Messiah because they have already decided that he isn't. And when we come to the text of Scripture, we make that judgment against ourselves sometimes. When we decide that something cannot be true, well, then you will never see that as the truth because you've already decided it's impossible. And I think we run into that here.
Yeah. There's one other interesting thing to me in this passage. There's lots, but one other really interesting thing in this passage. He says, "You will seek me and you will not find me." I think it was Mark Twain, or at least it's attributed to him, that he said, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And here you see, "You will seek me and you will not find me." And all I can think is, and you preached on this, this term, "but he is not here, for he is risen," this is exactly what happens later in this book, is that they come to find him at the tomb, and they cannot find him because he's not there. I don't think he's speaking specifically of that at this point, but it's interesting that the Spirit uses this terminology at this point to talk about what Jesus says to them about where he's going, that they can't come.
Yeah. It's at least an echo, at the very least. Yeah. All right, we've got 5 minutes. We probably don't have time to get into the living water.
Oh, this is
We can probably cover that in 5 minutes. So let's just kind of finish up where we are. This idea of seeking him but not being able to find him, this idea of him going out among the Greeks. The people that he's talking to are not ignorant of the Scriptures. It's not like he's speaking to people and he's talking a different language. They have the exact same foundation. And so we will often say sometimes, and I know that I have said it in the past, if you just give somebody the Bible, they will be able to find the truth. That's clearly not the case, because these people had the same foundation, right? They have the same text that they're working from as Jesus. And so there is something else present. There's a reason why Jesus is able to see him. Well, I mean, Jesus can see himself as the Messiah for a variety of reasons. But there's got to be a reason why they're not coming to the same conclusion. So how does that work?
Well, Sermon on the Mount, "Seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be open, ask and it shall be given." When he's talking about seeking here, I think it's in light of the context of the last 3 chapters. They're not hearing him. They're seeking him on their terms, not his terms. And it goes back to what Moses said in Deuteronomy, at the end of Deuteronomy. He said, "Look, don't worry about the stuff you don't know." I'm paraphrasing, obviously. You focus on what God has said and do what you know. Jesus is saying, you focus on what I'm telling you and what the prophets have said, and you're gonna find me. That's seeking me. You can't find me here because you're not looking for me. You're looking for something else. To your point earlier, both of your points. I've got in my head what he's supposed to be, therefore, is he the Christ or not? I don't know. Well, what did the prophets say, and what is Christ saying, and what has Christ done? They're not seeking that. They're not hearing that. And I think that's what he's saying here, literally, to them. And look what they do after he says it. They talk among themselves. They still don't go to him. It's not about him, it's about them. And it's an easy trap for us all to fall into.
I always thought it was interesting that when God manifests himself in human flesh, he comes as a teacher.
Yes.
And then you go to Ephesians 4, and you have this listing of the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, that is teachers. We got those slightly out of order. Teachers.
Yes.
The Great Commission. Go make disciples of all nations. That's a student. Go make students of all nations. That means that you are going to then take the role of instructor or teacher. You've got the man in Acts chapter 8, when Philip comes to him, "Do you understand what you're reading?" The response is, "How can I unless somebody guides me? I need a teacher." And so one of the things that we see is the reason why the scribes and Pharisees are not coming to the same conclusions is they're not coming to the teacher.
And if you take that one step, this next section plays right into that conversation. I mean, it's like John. We're following John's thought process as he's presenting this information. That's a teaser for next week.
Yeah, it intrigues me along that line that all of these guys who don't get it, they all had the honorific title
Yes.
of teacher. rabbi. And quite frankly, rabbi at this point was almost like Mr. in a lot of ways. But there's a great irony there in that they were, in fact, not teachers of what they were being called. Literally every time that somebody spoke to them, they said teacher, and they were not teachers at all, nor were they willing to listen to the teacher.
All right, we've one last comment, and then we'll be out of time.
Yeah, where it says Jesus had little time, he would have to be crucified and ascend to the Father. It was not up to the Jewish leaders to determine what his life was, but it was his Father's. And in the verse that he says, where I go, you cannot come, the Jewish leaders either didn't comprehend what Jesus meant, or because of their pride stood in their way, rejected it, knowing that what he was claiming, that he was equal with God, was blasphemy, and that they just couldn't accept that. So it's either one of the two. They can't comprehension or both because of their pride. Were unwilling to accept it and still wanted to seize Jesus.
All right, we'll stop there for the day. One more.
I just have a quick announcement. I want to thank everybody so much for being here this morning. I want to thank Stephen and Tim and all the comments. Unbelievable turnout. We waited over a year for this to happen, and this is so exciting. I was told we have about 160 people in the building right now. Lots of kids, excited kids, and it's just great. Thank you so much. As the kids' classes are ending, just a reminder so that we don't have a lot of people out mingling and wandering around the halls, please stay in the auditorium. The kids will come to you. Teachers and the deacons will be bringing them down to you. So if you would just remain here until they get here, we would certainly appreciate it. Any other final thought? All right, thank you so much.